In the novel Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton states, "Now let us take in order the innovations that are the notes of the new theology or the modernist church." We concluded the last chapter with the discovery of one of them. The very doctrine which is called the most old-fashioned was found to be the only safeguard of the new democracies of the earth. This aspect of modernism that Chesterton addresses has had a large impact on the world, especially over the last century.
Modernism is the concept of viewing old art, politics, sciences, and life in general in a more revitalized modern way. One characteristic of modernism is nihilism, which is the rejection of all religious and moral principles as the only means of obtaining social progress. Using this, modernists refused to accept the moral codes of society, and they did this because they felt morality was restricting and limiting them. Along with this rejection of religion and morals, other things that were rejected were arts, politics, sciences, and philosophy. These rejections, and especially the rejection of science, was a result of the rapid improvements in technology. One way modernism has directly affected the church is by causing people to believe that the church's doctrines should be updated and changed, which is something that the Catholic Church strongly disagrees with.
Art was one of the first concepts where modernism was seen. One example of this was Edouard Manet, who was a French modernist painter in the first 19th century. He was one of the first of many modernist painters. He was born in an upper-class household with strong political connections. He rejected the future envisioned for him and became a painter. His first paintings, Olympia and The Luncheon at the Grass, created controversy for young painters as it broke away from the normal way women were painted. Another concept where modernism was seen is mathematics. René Descartes was a mathematician, philosopher, and metaphysician who broke away from the previous beliefs of society by rejecting substantial forms as explanatory principles in physics. He believed in the thesis that all knowledge must come from sensation, as well as the idea that science of his time would not move forward from how it was.
A cultural example of modernism is the House of Parliament of Bangladesh. This is a representation of modernism because it represents brutalist architecture, a specific type of modernist architecture. This type of architecture is block-like and tends to seem like a fortress. It can be seen in many government buildings, and today it is used for all types of infrastructure. It represents the changes that occurred during World War II and the effect that World War II had on the modernist movement. These are some examples of how modernism has affected the world, especially people's view of the doctrines of the Catholic Church.
Truth cannot fundamentally change. If Catholic doctrine is true, even the opinions change, the doctrine itself does not change. What changes is the perception of the interpretation of the doctrines. The doctrines of the church can develop, but the teachings themselves don't change based on the challenges modernism proposes.
A research professor at Loyola College states, "The loss of papal states, the constant political revolutions, and the bitter opposition of liberalism to the church, exemplified in the expulsion of religious orders from France and Germany, made the church understandably suspicious of the new intellectual currents of the period." In November of 1907, Pope Pius published a motu proprio titled Praestantia Scripturae, which bound Catholics in conscience to embrace the decisions of the Pontifical Biblical Commission and imposed the penalty of excommunication on those who contradicted Lamentabili or Pascendi. In 1907, Pope Pius X called modernism the synthesis of all heresies and considered it a dead issue. There is an important distinction between adapting the timeless truth of the gospel to the modern world and adopting the doctrines of modernism that Pope Pius X condemns in Pascendi Dominici Gregis.
G.K. Chesterton, an English critic or philosopher, was very against modernism and wrote off modernism as a form of snobbery. He states in his novel All Things Considered, the real objection to modernism is simply that it is a form of snobbishness. It is an attempt to crush a rational opponent, not by reason, but by some mystery and superiority, by hinting that one is specially up to date or particularly in the know.
Stained glass windows are one type of cultural representation of Catholicism. The Catholic Church has many different types of art, but one of the main ways they display art is through stained glass windows. When looking at stained glass windows, they have a traditional look that has not changed over many years. This shows that the Catholic Church has some kind of rules and upholds tradition. Another cultural representation of Catholicism is Notre Dame. When thinking about what a traditional building of a church looks like, Notre Dame is one that comes to mind. It has the traditional brick look with all the traditional Catholic elements, like a crucifix, a bell tower, and an altar. This shows that the Catholic Church follows some guidelines and does not change. These are a few examples of how Catholicism is still very much present in our day-to-day lives.
Modernism has, in general, weakened faith and devotion, I think, for Catholics. It's made the faith seem less relevant. Because what happens is, the whole idea of modernism, basically you're trying to synthesize Catholicism with modern ways of thinking, which are completely incompatible with what Catholicism has always been. And so if you're doing that, then you're giving these modern ways of thinking priority. And so Catholicism loses what's distinctive about it. It becomes one more thing in the modern world. It's not anything particularly special. And so there's not any real impelling reason to give it your full commitment. So as a result, I think faith just kind of gets pushed to the side, which is, of course, a danger if our supreme good as human beings is to achieve union with God. Well, at the beginning of it, 1907, you had Pope Pius X issue his encyclical Pascendi, and then the oath against modernism in 1910. He started making theologians take that oath, which was condemning, all of that was condemning some of these modernist propositions. So up to the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, modernism was just straight up condemned and really kind of marginalized. Vatican II opened up some possibilities to be interpreted in ways that were favorable to modernism. So since the 1960s, I think modernist positions have become more widespread within the church. But those condemnations from Pius X are still binding. So officially, the church is anti-modernism. In practice, there are modernist theologians within the church.
Yeah.
Well, a major responsibility of the Pope is to defend the truth of the faith. So he has to condemn errors and then promote the truth. And why does truth matter? Ultimately, it's because we make decisions on how to live our lives based on what we believe about the world and about ourselves. So if we believe the wrong things, we're going to make wrong decisions, and we're not going to reach our supreme goal, right? And so if our supreme good is to be united with God, we need to know the truth about God and the truth about ourselves and about the world so that we can make decisions that lead us in that direction. So to condemn the errors of modernism, the point was basically to say this is a false path, right? You don't want to follow this because it's going to lead you away from that ultimate fulfillment.
Yeah,
So the truths of the faith, Catholic dogmas are not changeable because they're about things that don't change. God doesn't change. The truth about God is the same now as it was 2,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago and at the beginning of time. The truth about the human person, human nature, what's good for us, objectively speaking, that doesn't change over time. So if we were to, let's say, change the Nicene Creed, we say that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, all of that. If we were to say that and change that and say, like some modernists do, well, Jesus wasn't actually divine, right? Either Jesus used to be divine and isn't divine anymore, or the church was wrong about saying that he was divine back in the 4th century. Well, he didn't change, right? Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So that would mean the church was wrong in the 4th century. Well, if the church was wrong in the 4th century, why should we believe what it's saying now? Because whatever it says now then would be something that could be changed in another 200 years or whatever. And it would just be one more thing that's a voice of whatever we want it to say. So it can't change because the things that it's talking about don't change. And if what it had to say could be wrong about those things, then it really wouldn't be worth listening to.